So we are a little nervous because this is our first in-person event after COVID, and we are super happy to have you all here and are delighted that you decided to come and that you're joining us now. And I'm, of course, especially delighted to have you here, David, our keynote speaker. David is President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, but of course, I think most people know you because you were kind of the British State Secretary, the British Secretary of State for the Environment, an MP for a long time. And you will talk today about the global implications of the war in Ukraine and what it means to us Europeans. And I think this is very good for us in Berlin because we're very much a navel-gazing country. So we always like to talk about ourselves and the world, not about the world, more about ourselves and what the world does to us. So looking beyond our own nose, I think it's not our particular strength. So very happy to have you here to help us. And I think you will address what impact the war has, the kind of on Europe, but beyond the future of the world order, geopolitical situation, kind of some advice for Europeans how to deal with it, maybe. And to kick us off, I wanted to share a quote of our Chancellor here, Olaf Scholz, who has just written an op-ed a couple of days ago in Die Welt, one of our most prestigious newspapers. And he wrote an essay or an op-ed on democracy. And there was one sentence in it which I found particularly striking because he says, rarely have the democratic countries of the world stood together as united as they do today. Together, as democracies, we support Ukraine. Together, we impose the toughest sanctions against Russian aggression. Together, we strengthen our defense. And when I read it, I thought this might be a little optimistic, looking at countries like India, South Africa, Israel. But I'm very much interested in your take now, David.
Thank you very much, Jana. It's really nice to be in Berlin and very nice to be in the same room as other people, not just on Zoom. I've just been in Moldova and in Ukraine with my colleague Harlem Desir, who is the Senior Vice President for Europe of the International Rescue Committee, which is the organization I'm lucky enough to lead. And we're here today in Berlin, where we have extensive office now because of our partnerships with the German government, German civil society, and also aid workers working in Germany with refugees, helping to integrate them into German life. And tomorrow we're going to Brussels. And I spoke to Mark Leonard, your CEO, my about,
boss, yeah.
Sorry?
My boss.
Yeah, I was going to say, he said, look, you need someone really brilliant to be talking to. So he nominated you, Jana, to have a conversation. And he asked me to just spend 15 minutes or so trying to talk about this, not exactly a conundrum, but I think a feature of the current situation, which is that essentially the West is more united than it was before, not fully united, but more united. But the world seems equally divided as it was before 24th of February. And I want to try and explore that question and its implications and whether anything can be done about it. Now, I have very much in my, and I do so, you referred to Europe, I've lived and worked in the United States for the last 8 years, but I'm still very much a European. And so I do want to think about Europe's place in the West and how Europe thinks about this global conundrum, global dilemma, global question. Because I do feel, and we've got Wolfgang, others here who lived through the 90s, acted in significant roles through the 90s. It feels like this is a defining period as well. This Zeitenwende, this after 30 years, it feels like we're at a very important period when it's weeks when decades happen. And I'm conscious, leading a humanitarian organization, that there are many fronts in the humanitarian quote unquote war at the moment. I mean, there are besieged communities in Ukraine, there are internally displaced people in Ukraine, there are refugees across Europe, and we can explore that. But that's my day job, and I'm very happy to speak about it in the questions, but it's not going to be what I focus my remarks on. I mean, suffice to say that the degree of trauma that we saw in Moldova, in Ukraine itself, we were in central Ukraine yesterday, is very, very high indeed. trauma, not just of displacement of the individuals, but displacement of individuals who know that their fathers, brothers, husbands are fighting while they are fleeing. So it's a very, very intense, raw humanitarian situation. But that's not what I'm going to focus on. What I want to focus on is the fact that, to me, it would be comforting to think that the war in Ukraine has united the world in horror. But while it would be comforting, it would be wrong to think that. As the Western world has mobilized to defend itself and offers support for the humanitarian consequences, I mean, the European Union's move in respect of Ukrainian refugees beats anything that it's done for refugees from other parts of the world in its breadth and in its seriousness. There's a wider geopolitics, and that's what I thought I would talk about for 10 or 12 minutes. What I think is that it's too early to know how the war is going to finish. We just don't know what President Putin is going to say in the 9th of May events on Monday. And the fact that we don't yet know the outcome of the war is a remarkable testimony to the resilience of the Ukrainian people. But I don't think it's too early to plan for the geopolitical consequences. And that's what I want to try and explore a little bit. Many people have said that the decision of the Russian president to invade Ukraine was a wake-up call for the West. And you've certainly got experience of what that wake-up call means in Germany. But I think it's worth remarking that the war has not gone the way he intended, either militarily or politically, as regards the West. Despite the squalls of Brexit, despite the re-election of Prime Minister Orban in Hungary, despite the French election, I do think it's not unreasonable to talk about greater unity and greater action from the liberal democratic world than was expected, greater decisiveness. The EU agreement on refugees, the economic sanctions, the alignment of climate-driven policies for decarbonization that various people thought wouldn't be delivered, now aligned with national security-driven requirements to end dependence on Russian oil and gas, the new defense and security commitments and arrangements. And I think Alex Stubb is watching from an airport, but he's someone who's talked for a long time about Finland's place in NATO. Sweden and Finland look like they will be joining NATO. And I think it's also worth saying to a European audience that the US administration has facilitated this decisiveness of action, this wake-up call, in a way that has been very sure-footed in its partnership with the European allies, that has been genuinely a partnership. And I don't want to say that the squabbles about Afghanistan and AUKUS have been forgotten, but they feel a long time ago in the light of the way the administration has conducted itself. But my basic fear is that the vote in the United Nations, 141-5, to condemn the invasion, I would say flattered to deceive. And in fact, the Economist Intelligence Unit says that the leaders of 2/3 of the world population refused to join the condemnation, despite the fact that it was the invasion was such an egregious breach of international law. And the countries that did not condemn don't fit into a convenient axis of autocracy. The countries that refuse to condemn the invasion include South Africa, they include India, they include Brazil. And I think it's worth pausing to recognize that there's no single reason why countries across Asia, Latin America, the Middle East are refusing to join countries like Singapore and Colombia, which did denounce the invasion. I mean, Singapore's decision to impose sanctions without a UN Security Council resolution is quite striking, given Singapore's history and its position. But most countries did not. Many countries did not. And I would say there's been more of a shrug than a shock in the reaction. Why is that? I think it's worth being blunt with ourselves about why that is. There's no one point, but impunity is perceived to be practiced by many strong countries, not just by Russia. So there's a charge against the West of hypocrisy. there's the allegation of double standards in the way in which Western countries have applied their own values to issues of conflict around the world, including, for example, in Yemen, which is an area where the International Rescue Committee works. There are interests that are binding countries to Russia, for example, through its arms industry, or its mercenaries who are increasingly active across parts of Africa. And there is fear, I think, of being caught on one side of a standoff between the US and China, amongst many countries. And so I think it's worth trying to think about this reticence and understand what it means and what it implies. And the fact that Germany is hosting the G7 meeting next month, I think.
End of June.
End of June means that there's quite soon, there's an opportunity, frankly, for the G7 to make itself relevant again. If the right decisions are taken, the right words are used, the right agenda is set. I think it's premature to talk about answers, but I think it's right to be talking about an agenda to address, if you buy my argument that we should be concerned by this divided world, then I don't think it's too early to think about an agenda that needs to be set. And obviously the G7 will talk about the defense of Ukraine and support for the defense of Ukraine. But I think there are external challenges that need to be, geopolitical challenges that need to be addressed too. And I thought I would just say briefly here, 4 areas that I think need to be on the agenda in thinking about this divided world question. And the first one does speak rather directly to the quotation that you read out from Die Welt, which from the Chancellor's statement in Die Welt. I haven't actually seen the article, but it's relevant in a way that will become immediately obvious. Because I think the first part of the agenda concerns the framing of the issues that are raised by the invasion of Ukraine. And there seems to be no doubt among Russia watchers who I read and listen to quite carefully that the democratic tilt of Ukraine over the last decade especially has been a source of irritation and fear inside Moscow, inside Russia. So emphasizing the democratic tilt, not just the Western tilt. However, I'm very concerned about what I see as quite grave limitations in framing the debate as one of democracy versus autocracy. The invasion represents a fundamental transgression of the rule of law. So do attacks on civilians that are happening as we speak. And to my mind, it is the rule of law that is under the hammer, not just the democratic state or the choices of a democratic state. And a framing of the conflict, that there is an alternative framing of the conflict, which is not democracy versus autocracy, it is the rule of law versus impunity, or slightly more populist terminology, law versus anarchy. And I think there are advantages in framing this as law versus anarchy, law versus impunity, that are worth considering. I mean, for example, it broadens the potential coalition of support so that countries like Singapore, which has taken a very strong stand, feel at home. It also, frankly, tests China at its weakest point, because China says it supports a rules-based international system. And frankly, also, law versus anarchy or law versus impunity sounds less self-preening than democracy versus autocracy. And I think an absence of self-preening is important given the problems that exist within the liberal democratic world. So that's my first point, the framing matters. Secondly, I think there is pressing need to get the liberal democratic house in order when it comes to foreign engagement on issues of war and peace. These are among, the G7 are amongst the richest countries in the world. They pride themselves on acting within the rule of law, but they don't always do so. And there is a double challenge, I think, in this respect. One is that Russia and China are activists around the world, deploying a range of diplomatic, military, and development tools to make friends and influence people. And the charge of double standards, secondly, second part of it, needs to be addressed head on, from development aid to military partnerships to climate change to human rights, as the West conducts its foreign policy. Simple point, the US is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, which is just a key among European states. I was very proud to be part of a government that signed up to the ICC. The US is also leery about issues of universal jurisdiction that have recently been used in Germany in a rather interesting combination of civil society and government to prosecute war criminals arising from Syria. And there are a range of security partnerships. I think the US has more than 90 security partnerships, but European countries have many security partnerships around the world that don't put the rule of law at the heart of those partnerships. Frankly, the treatment of asylum seekers along the US and EU borders too often does not live up to international law either. And there are other areas, for example, the economic isolation of Afghanistan, I think offends against the values that the West says it stands for. So I think there's part of the agenda is about how the West gets its house in order. Thirdly, I'm concerned that the liberal democratic world needs to do more than pay homage to the goals or the rhetoric of a rules-based international order. It needs to think very, very hard about how to strengthen it. And I confess immediately to be unsure of a number of aspects of this, but it strikes me that we have to understand head on that the rules-based system was not strong enough before the invasion of Ukraine. At the International Rescue Committee, we publish every December an emergency watch list of the 20 countries most likely to be subject to humanitarian distress in the year ahead. And last December, we published the 2022 version, and it was an unusual because it didn't just talk about the humanitarian situation, it talked about what we call system failure in the international system. And the system failure we spoke about was at the level of state failure, diplomatic failure, legal failure, and then operational failure in the humanitarian and development system. And that led us to go beyond our narrow mandate and talk about how the rules of humanitarian access are protected, how the war crimes are investigated and prosecuted, how the UN Security Council works in cases of mass atrocity, including a strengthened role for the General Assembly. These things have not been on the agenda. President Zelensky has called for a reform of the international system. And at the moment, the P5 position and more or less the G7 position is it's too complicated to talk about. And I don't think that's a sustainable position. Fourth and final point, and then I will wind up. I do think we have to recognize how seriously and deeply is felt the view across significant parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, that Western engagement is episodic, it's erratic, when it needs to be strategic, context appropriate, and consistent. And countries in these regions are desperately exposed to the global failure to deliver what are called global public goods, from health and economic security to support for refugee hosting states and for responsible action against international terrorism. And they want to see more from the G7. One obvious priority area that the G7 could actually make progress on in this area has a direct link to Ukraine, which is the rise in food costs in large parts of the developing world, where dependence on Russian and Ukrainian grain and fertilizer is high. And I just want to flag for people, at the moment, I think it's at least equally likely that the sanctions on Russia get the blame for the rising food prices, as it is that the invasion of Ukraine gets the blame for the rising food and energy prices. And so there is a contest for public opinion globally, as well as in our own countries, that behooves dramatic action in respect of investments in agri-food systems in vulnerable countries around the world, such as the Horn of Africa, which is desperately exposed at the moment. And there are programs, I don't know the details, the Horizon Europe program. I was told this afternoon that I think Germany has committed €1 billion to this. Frankly, we've got to think much bigger, because this is a much bigger than €1 billion, even a €10 billion aid problem. There's a food system issue. Let me just finish with the following thought. You referred to the active German debate. I saw Joschka Fischer last week at the funeral of Madeleine Albright. He was a contemporary of hers, and I got to know her. But I very much appreciated an article that Joschka wrote some years ago where he talked about the Atlantic Charter of 1941 as the quote unquote birth certificate of the West, which is a very resonant phrase. And the Atlantic Charter committed to human rights as well as to free trade as underpinning the world order after the Second World War. It was signed in October 1941. Now, obviously, the difference between 1941 and today, one difference is that the West as a geopolitical entity has much less diplomatic, security, and economic influence relative to the rest of the world than it did then. But the shock of the Ukraine crisis cannot turn back the clock, but it should, in my view, prompt a really thoroughgoing examination within the liberal democratic world of how to sustain the values that underpin our systems from internal threat, which is real, but also from external isolation, which I think is the fearsome prospect that's raised by the global shrug that we've seen in respect in some parts of the world to this catastrophic situation that Harlem and I got to see over the last couple of days. So that's what I wanted to say. I'm sorry if you give an ex-politician a platform, he speaks for 5 minutes longer than, count yourself lucky that I didn't speak for 55 minutes longer than I was invited to. But
it comes from aging.
Thank you very much for reminding me of that as well, yes. But I am all ears, really. This is a great group here, and I'd love to hear from you and hear from others as well.
Thank you very much for kicking us off and for presenting some of those thoughts. Maybe just a quick reaction. I think it's really striking how little many of the things that you've just said kind of play a role in the German debate. I'm sure they play a role in the Chancellery and the Foreign Office, of course, but when you look in our newspapers or kind of the debates we are having right now about Zeitenwende, about how to reposition a German foreign policy, as I said, we are very much navel-gazing, I think. We talk about our previous failures a lot, about Ostpolitik and what went wrong, and I think this is all justified. We talk about our energy dependency, but there are articles in newspapers about the food crisis, but I think people are really not aware in the broader public kind of what kind of perfect storm is developing at our southern borders. And also, it's very much about us. For example, we had now a debate whether kind of if Germany sends basically heavy arms to Ukraine, that would trigger a third world war. And we did not talk about, the American weapons already delivered, but it was very much about us. And it's just a striking observation for me that we should talk more about the points you've raised. Another point I think is interesting from a German perspective is what I discussed with actually my colleague Jeremy, who is a new Berliner since a couple of months now, maybe half a year. And so he told me that for him, there is this famous sentence, I think it's a Kagan sentence, kind of if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And he said, your German hammer is very much your moralism. So for you, you can maybe explain that a bit further later, but I think he has a good point here for us. It needs to be about values and about the global good. It cannot be about, geopolitical interests. So we lack an understanding when we look at other actors who are driven by other motivation, and we think it's highly suspicious. And the third thing is a lot of people in this town have started to talk about a new Cold War with Russia and about a new form of containment or engagement. So we are looking for a new strategy towards Russia. And the problem is that our strategy right now with the sanctions and with kind of decoupling now from Russian energy, it's very much based on a new Iron Curtain, basically, or kind of decoupling. My question maybe also to you is if that is the right approach, because you just said that this is not going to work, and I think many people here know that in a globalized world this is not going to work. But how can we basically? There is good reason why there are sanctions and why we decouple. So how can we basically deal with an aggressor if we don't have all the other countries on board? So what could be the Western strategy? You offered already rule of law versus anarchy. But maybe more concretely, and then I would like to open it up, of course. And I explain how we do this because we have this beautiful chair over here, but maybe you can explain a bit more kind of what you would advise as a strategy for a country like Germany, for example, trying to get countries that are somewhat sitting on the fence in this conflict to join our side. So, for example, the Chancellor kind of going to India, for example. So what do you think should the conversation be about? So how can we kind of bring more countries on board? Or is that the aim in the end?
Well, look, I will answer that, but I think it would be really, I read your interview. I said to you before we met that you did an interview where you said Ostpolitik was wrong for many reasons, but one reason was it was only about Russia, it wasn't about the East. Just say a bit more about that, because I think that's, and then I will answer your question. I'm not just trying to I'm not trying to buy more time to think about the question, which I am, but I do think it's relevant. Just say what you meant by that, because I thought it was a very striking comment that you made in that interview.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know if that perception is shared in this room. I mean, here are high-ranking German officials, former officials, but my perception is that, I mean, at least for a long time, Germany always prioritized its relationship with Russia over the heads of the Central and Eastern European member states. And I think there is an awareness of this in Germany. Even prior to the war, I think Heiko Maas has started to talk about a new Ostpolitik already a while ago, but I think we've never really implemented it. So we've never really proven that we are serious. And I think one of the mistakes was really that we prioritized our relationship with Russia. And even now, I think it is a problem. So yesterday evening, I attended a political talk show and we discussed an open letter that German intellectuals have written to the Chancellor, where they basically say it's not, or it goes beyond the moral kind of ability, it's not only the responsibility of the Ukrainian government to decide how much and how long they want to fight. It's basically our responsibility as humanity to make sure that we don't have too many atrocities, and we should not send heavy weapons to Ukraine. And for me, that was just another example for patronizing a country, telling them, so we know better what's best for you and the world. And I just think this is a...
Well, I think that's very striking. I mean, what I took out of your interview was the idea that Ostpolitik was referenced as relations with the Soviet Union. And true. In so doing, it ignored not just the republics that were within the Soviet Union, but it ignored Eastern European countries that were in the Warsaw Pact. And I tell you why that really struck me as a powerful point, because you can still hear people say, what's the West's off-ramp for President Putin? As if the Ukrainians don't have agency of their own in this process. And so that's why it struck me as a powerful point that you were making.
That is actually a feature of the German debate for a long time, that we always talk about our historical guilt towards Russia, but we not enough, I think, mention our historical guilt vis-a-vis Belarus or Ukraine. So these victims are forgotten, or kind of Russia now stands for everything bad we've done to the Soviet Union. That is something that, yeah. So
I find often there's talk about NATO expansion as if it's this Pac-Man machine eating up other countries. It's a defensive alliance that countries opt to try to join. And so I think maybe that's relevant to what you said. Look, I'm not going to try and advise Germany, or it would be hubristic to do so. But I think the way I would answer your question is just with three thoughts about the way the West positions itself. The first is, and I'm going to use a word that is going to convey a meaning that I don't intend, and I'll try and explain what I do intend. First point, we've got to choose what we preach. Now, the word preach carries with it a sense of evangelical
Sounds
zeal.
very German.
But I'm not trying to, I'm actually going to argue against evangelical zeal in this respect, still less sort of sort of hubristic self-aggrandizement. When I say we should choose carefully what we preach, I come back to this point about the remarkable achievement of the post-Second World War settlement was to establish for the first time in international relations that individual rights stood alongside the rights of states in international law. That had never been done before. It didn't address the question of what happens when those rights clash, but it established in international law that individual rights, human rights, refugees' rights, etc., had instance in international law, and they stood alongside the rights of states not to be invaded and not to have their rights, their territory or their sovereignty abjured. Now, when I say we should choose what we preach, I'm saying we should frame this as an argument about an international system founded on rules. And the truth about the post-Second World War statement, partly reflecting power relations at the time, is that countries that were communist and countries that were capitalist, countries that were autocratic and countries that were democratic, all signed up to it. Now, 70 years later, the world is more interdependent than ever before. It needs that collective management more than ever before, and it needs to check the abuse of power more than ever before. And I'm really focused on this law versus impunity framing as being the foundation. Secondly, we have to live up to our own standards. I think it's impossible to overstate the importance of living up to our own protestations. Thirdly, I think that it's got to be in the interests of countries around the world to live up to the rule of law themselves. And I think that that's why the word preach is, I've put in quotes, because preaching doesn't do it. But the consistency and constancy of our own engagement is absolutely central to that. Because if it's not in the interests of countries to align with the rule of law, then they won't. And I do think it's worth calling out that there are many elephants in this room. There are elephants in the room of European disunity around these questions. There's also, we don't know as Europeans, how is America going to develop in the next period. We've been through 4 years when it didn't want to make itself the leader of the strategic rule-based system. We don't know what will happen after 2024. So these questions about how the West defines itself, positions itself, allies itself, what and who we are dependent on, I think is a very, very open question if one's willing to address it centrally. And I come here very much with as many questions, if not many times as many questions as I have answers. But I think that's the way I would try and navigate the perfectly relevant and good challenge that you've made.
I have a follow-up question, but I just wanted to explain how we want to frame the conversation, because I really invite you to have a conversation with us and David, first and foremost. So that's why we have this chair here. So if you have a question or a comment or just want to share your assessment, and as you have heard, David is very much interested in our debate right now and kind of how Germany is
developing.
Please come here. That also facilitates the live stream, so people will not only hear you, but also see you. And I think Wolfgang is already raising his hand. But I have a follow-up question, because I'm intrigued. I think this is all very plausible and credible, rule of law versus anarchy. But when I look at, for example, how this conflict with Russia has developed over years before the war started, it was very much about the basically European security architecture and how to interpret its rules and principles. I can remember various conversations with Russians in 2015 and 16, where they basically said, well, if you look at Helsinki or kind of Paris, the Charter of Paris, and it's kind of, they read something completely different into it than we did. So they emphasized basically that kind of that it's about sovereignty and it's about borders. And so the interpretation of these treaties were so different and led to many misunderstandings, or basically that every country or every side thought, yeah, this is my interpretation is the right one. So, and the liberal international order is also a very bizarre and abstract construct. So how do you make sure that everybody agrees basically on the same law or rule of law?
Well, it's very hard, obviously, to state the obvious. My feeling is that there has grown in the Russian leadership both an enormous sense of personal and national victimhood and a high degree of contempt for the divisions and weaknesses of the West. And I think that speaks to both. I think you can only understand or come to terms with the different definitions of the rules if you add to it a recognition that power matters in this, and relative sense of power matters strongly. And our own actions in energy policy, which you've mentioned, contributed to a sense of dependence and contributed to a sense of weakness that I think then led to a miscalculation. And I just want to say a word about what the miscalculation was. I think it's a very open question whether, if the Russian leadership had known then what they know now, whether they would have gone ahead with the invasion on the 24th of February. If, just for the sake of argument, you accept that they wouldn't have gone ahead, that means deterrence failed. It wasn't actually a failure to do with the rules-based system, it was a failure of deterrence. If you think that the sanctioning of the central bank, the wider set of sanctions, the unity that was established within the West, the defense agreements that have been made, if you think they weren't priced in to the decision-making calculus, then you have to ask, well, why did deterrence fail? And I think it wasn't to do with the arguments about the rules-based system. It was to do with a view about the divisions and weaknesses that existed within the Western world. And so I would say, yes, there are arguments of a detailed kind and allegations of hypocrisy on all sides, which have been a feature of this. But there's also power plays that are going on. And I think my reflection is that deterrence didn't work in this case, and that should really behoove us to think very, very carefully about what went wrong in our presentation of our own position.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think it would be super if you...
rise to the challenge.
Yes, fantastic. Fantastic, our hot chair. I hope it's comfortable.
Great. First of all, it's such a pleasure to see you here.
Thanks.
And I have, if I may, just two very brief footnotes to the points made earlier. Then I want to ask you a real question. Footnote number one, quite honestly, historically speaking, Ostpolitik started in Warsaw. When Willy Brandt made his famous, knee fall, that's where it all started. And we did pay attention in those years to the various interests of Warsaw Pact member countries like Romania and Poland. And it was only the error we made, we actually made much later, over the last decade or so, to focus exclusively on Russia and pay no attention. You are, of course, absolutely right. Not enough attention to Ukraine and I think a number of other issues. First point. So we should remember that the original concept of Ostpolitik was not a concept focused on the Soviet Union. It was a much broader concept. Second point I want to make is this international law point you raised. In an abbreviated manner, I would claim that the international law, which was first developed, in 1648, and which we have inherited from our grandfathers, etc., to this day, as presented and as applied, is actually a set of international law principles which is designed to protect dictators. At least it does not exclude the protection of dictators. And I think what our mission ought to be, and I've tried to think about this in a more systematic manner, is to work to changing the principles of international law. They have been changing over the last centuries all the time. It's not a set, established set of principles. We should try to change it in a manner that allows us to say international law protects not only the sovereign king or the dictator, sovereignty of states, it also protects the individual. An international law that protects, that, you know, that is an element of human security, not only state security. I think if the West could identify themselves with this kind of mission, way to go. My question here is about your very important point, the world divided. And I think we have not, in the German debate, not paid enough attention. We've been extremely gratified about the 140 plus countries, you know, with us, etc. And we have not paid enough attention to the point. I participated recently in a debate with some senior Chinese decision makers in a virtual debate, obviously. And when some of us, it was a few other Europeans and Americans were participating in this debate, when the point was raised with these Chinese people that China would do itself a huge favor if it presented themselves, they present themselves to Europe as a country that uses the enormous power that China has to restrain Russia, to find a way, an off-ramp or whatever you want to call it, for Putin. In other words, if China could present itself as a force of peace and the de-escalation, wow, what reputational gain that would mean for China's relationship with Europe. Enormous opportunity. The Chinese response to these types of suggestions was, okay, sounds good. We cannot do this because if we did it, we would be seen as abandoning our systemic rivalry with the United States. In other words, the Chinese lens is a lens that does not allow the Chinese to look at Ukraine as a separate case. They look at it through the lens of the US-Chinese confrontation. My question to you, former Foreign Secretary, is how can we help them get rid of this obsession with the rivalry with America? Because I think this is extremely important.
Look, I think you're right in your assessment of the Chinese fear. Of course, with one caveat, which is that you presented this as a way, quote unquote, for them to gain credibility in Europe.
Yeah, right.
Now, of course, in their own minds, the only way they'd be willing to do this was if no one knew that they'd done it.
Or if we abandoned the United States, in exchange.
Yeah, but the United States, as I said in the beginning, the United States has actually played a very constructive and engaged role with Europe in this. Look, it's so easy to be glib and ignorant about this kind of question. And my shorthand answer to your question is to refer people to Kevin Rudd's new book, which is called The Avoidable War. And Kevin first met Xi Jinping in 1986, when he was the Australian diplomat charged with facilitating a visit to China by Bob Hawke, who was then the Prime Minister of Australia. And Kevin has spent the last 7 years since he left office really trying to understand, reading in Mandarin what's being said. And his argument essentially is that a Cold War, or still worse, a hot war, will happen more by accident than by design, but it could happen. And the way to avoid it happening is for the red lines of each side to be absolutely clear to each other, Secondly, for there to be ferocious competition outside the red lines, and for global public goods. I can't remember if he uses exactly that phrase, but shared interests from health security to nuclear security to be pursued, climate security to be pursued in a thoroughgoing way. And the reason he believes such an approach is possible is he's got this very Chinese way of explaining the Chinese way of thinking in 10 concentric circles. I won't recite them all to you, but the central one of which is not global domination. The central one of which is the maintenance of the power of the Chinese Communist Party as being the derivative, the dispositive project that runs through all the other. So if you're asking how should the Western world think about its engagement with a China that is growing in this extraordinary way, I think he's much closer to explaining something coherent than anything else I've read or thought about on this. I just want to say one thing though about your second footnote, which is that I really believe that framing as rule of law versus the abuse of power versus impunity is precisely the way to get into the issue that you raise of individual rights as well as the strength of states. I was a strong supporter of responsibility to protect in 2005. But that ship has sailed a long way. It's been honoured in the breach rather than the observance. But I do think that there is a wide constituency around the world in fear of impunity as a underpinning. If that becomes the underpinning notion of international relations, that's dangerous. And I think that impunity exists in the economic domain, in the environmental domain, as well as in the conflict domain. And it speaks precisely to this balance of the rights of individuals as well as the rights of states. And I don't want to go to deliver myself of all of my thoughts on this, because it'll take the next 3 hours, but I've learned working for the International Rescue Committee, two of our staff were killed in northwest Syria by a Russian fighter jet launching missiles against them. They were driving an ambulance. And I see that as the tip of the iceberg of impunity, because the rights of those aid workers, who are Syrians themselves, civilians, could not be more clearly demarcated in international law. And those rights are to life and to livelihood, and both of them were denied. And what I believe is going on is that the degree of impunity in conflict zones around the world is the extreme end of impunity that's happening more widely in economic spheres, political spheres, etc. And if impunity can be exercised over people with very clearly defined rights, it's going to be even more exercised over people with less well-defined rights, whether to political protest, gender equality, or whatever. And so I think fighting this out in the most exposed zones of the world is something that I think is really important in and of itself, but it's also a sort of indicator of the wider, not democratic health, but the health of accountability, which I think is the opposite of impunity. So I haven't quite explained that as well as I'd like, but that's the commentary on a very interesting point, Wolfgang.
Thank you. Thank you for being the first in our hot seat. Other volunteers, I see my colleague Maida, but you need to...
I'm actually going to ask a quick question.
You've got to sit in the seat, otherwise we can't record you.
It's very short, so...
You have to stay for the answer and then give us, we might want to ask you a question.
Hi, first of all, thank you very much for
a
very interesting presentation. My name is Maida Ruge, and I'm a senior fellow here with the ECFR, but more importantly, a former customer of the International Rescue Committee. I've used your services, unfortunately, after the war in Bosnia, where I come from, and I've gone through the program of resettlement to Atlanta, Georgia.
Wow, I hope it was a good service that we provided.
Absolutely.
Few.
Having that kind of in mind, and having spent a couple of years in Washington, D.C. during the Trump administration, just a kind of very practical question in terms of future scenarios and the risks that you see and that are potentially on your radar. Given that we're talking about big issues on food security, potential famine, riots, and mass migration from Middle East, North Africa as a consequence of of the fact that Russia and Ukraine are responsible for 1/3 of global wheat supply. That scenario coupled with the upcoming 2024 elections you spoke about, we don't know where America is going to go. We have a project following a bit of a discussion within the very Make America Great Again camp of the Republican Party. And if you follow their discussions, there's not that much sympathy for Ukraine. There's exactly the sense that you mentioned, that sanctions are to blame for global food shortages, but also for rising energy prices. It's pointed out that Ukraine is the third most corrupt country, and the oligarchs and Zelensky are very much to blame, as opposed to Russia being the seventh most corrupt country in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So just combine these two trends with the potential scenario of a return of Trump administration or someone from the MAGA camp. What are the risks that you as IRC see for the kind of global, again, migration, and what does Europe need to?
This isn't an IRC point, this is a personal point, but the danger is the reverse of the title of this seminar. You ended up with divided West, united world in a pooled reaction to the divisions that then exist. So I think that's always the risk with isolationism. It's a risk with some versions of interventionism as well, but it's a danger of the risk of isolationism. Look, we as the International Rescue Committee, we're not a political organization. We have people from Republicans, Democrats who support us and provide our governance. But we're the largest refugee resettlement agency in the United States. You're one example of the 300,000 people that we've resettled in the last 40 years. And we went through the Trump years when resettlement went from 90,000 a year to 12,000 a year. So the risk is that we go back through that cycle. We're obviously an international humanitarian charity, and 40% of our income comes from US aid and other parts of the US system. So the resilience of the most basic attempts to tackle global inequality, which is what essentially are the services that we provide to people around the world, are on the hook. Now, I come from a country that's just cut its development budget by 1/3. The UK was spending £15 billion a year on humanitarian development aid. It's now spending £10 billion. So these budgets are cuttable. And so I think that there's a real, our priority is to use the Afghan situation, the Ukraine situation as real teachable moments, not just for the way we organize policy, but for the way in which people afflicted by conflict around the world are seen. And we don't think we can do that on our own at all. We don't have any sense that that would be ridiculous. But I think that, America is a very, very polarized polity, as you know well. And the unity that has been achieved across the Atlantic, you'd have to say, is hard won and potentially fragile. And that's why I think Europe and the wider West, because I think Canada's important to this, Australia's important to this, Japan is important to this, South Korea is important to this. The definition of the West, that's why I went back to that Joschka Fischer thing about it being a political, it being a birth certificate for a political idea, not a geographic idea.
How does the wider West?
Let me just one, sorry. I think the really important thing, and this is where I think Europe does have an opportunity with the discussions going on in Germany, with the discussion about a geopolitical EU. We, count ourselves as a European, we want to be at the table in 2024, not in a position asking the Americans to do things, but in a position where this is what we're doing. Strategic autonomy, etc. Now, the autonomy part of strategic autonomy, I think, query what that means, but the strategic part, I think we want to be there in a much stronger position than we were in 2016, 2017, or before.
Do you see any encouraging signs?
I do, yeah. I do. I think this has been a wake-up call in Europe the last few months. I think post February 24th, you live here, so you know better than I, but I think we're in a different position than we were then. And I think that there's a lot that is now going to be framed by the dangers of what we've seen happen in Ukraine, that makes me think Europe is in a much stronger position, not just to forge its own geopolitical identity, but also to think with others about how to do so.
Just a quick follow-up question on the wider West that you just brought up. So how do you envision the role of kind of this club in kind of, because we talked about rule of law versus anarchy, but is there a kind of, is the wider West kind of an idea that needs to be explored further, kind of, because that is something that is very kind of, I think that's the conviction here with our Indo-Pacific strategy, just to work with partners. And and do you think the wider West would survive another Trump presidency?
Well, I mean, yes, I think it would, because I think the countries that we're talking about, South Korea is not in the G7, but it's an extraordinary story that's happened there, and it's not the only one. I think prize what they've achieved. Now, I think that it's interesting that a year ago, when President Biden was talking about his summit of democracy or summit for democracy, I made the argument that what it should be is a set of commitments around accountability of power. Sorry to be, I'm sort of boring on about my basic point, but I think that's the rallying point. And it's a rallying point where, to use an unfortunate phrase, coalitions of the willing can do stuff. That's what I think is important. European Union plus others have weight. I mean, what was announced on digital services, that's a geopolitical act. What happened in respect of the Belarusian attempt to import or export migrants into Europe? The way that was pushed back using the private sector is a geopolitical, threatened sanctions on the private sector is a geopolitical act. So I think that there's more agency. I think what the Ukraine crisis shows is there's more agency than people often give credit for. But I think it has to be for the wider West, not just for Europe.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Maida. So more volunteers. Gerald, Jeremy, I'm sure you're volunteering. Jeremy.
Thanks. Hot seat.
And whoever else wants to sit here, just raise your hand, make yourself visible.
Hard to sit here. Thanks.
Now he's leaving the room.
Yeah. Well, look, I'm not a former IRC customer, but I might be someday, I guess. So I appreciate the work that you're doing, given the way things are going. But it was interesting to me that you said that you're a ex-politician, and I thought that the points that you made were very analytical. They didn't sound that political, which appeals to me. And so it made me feel like, it made me feel like I often feel like when I hear analytical points that I agree with, that they're brilliant, but they're totally politically implausible. And when I have sort of brought similar analyses to the Biden administration, and I think you probably hear something a little bit similar if you were talking to the Schultz people about, why are you saying this thing that he said in Die Welt the other day, given that, you must know that India is not on board, you must know that South Africa is not on board. The Biden administration people say to me, yeah, you're right, but we need to mobilize our population. They're making essentially a domestic political argument about the value that this democracy autocracy frame has. It's very comprehensible. It has been the mobilization force that they have used for the last 100+ years in the United States. It's really easy to write a speech about. I think it's a lot easier to write a speech about that than rule of law versus impunity. So I guess what I'm asking you is, can you put your politician hat back on, if you can remember it, and talk to me about how to create a political strategy for a guy like Joe Biden so that he can sell this to the American people, because on a certain, or the German people, because on a certain level, those are his toughest customers.
My perspective on that is twofold. One, his political success depends on control of inflation, delivery of effective migration and immigration issues, delivery for the American middle class in a broader sense, and a restoration of a sense of opportunity that many Americans clearly feel has been an opportunity for the next generation that clearly feel has been badly lost. So I think we shouldn't, would never kid ourselves where the international dimension fits into the calculus. The period after the Second World War was unusual, but even then, politics happened within a global construct rather than about a global construct. Secondly, I think that, actually I'll make 3 points. Secondly, I think that democracy versus autocracy needs to be defended at home against actors, external and internal. And there's a big argument about strengthening our own democracies, which in all sorts of ways are malfunctioning. So I think that's important. Thirdly, I think that the rule of law versus impunity is deeply sellable because of what impunity threatens. At some level, President Biden's right to talk about Putin's gas price hike. And that's a long way away from Ukraine. It's actually more true in Europe for gas, gas in America means petrol. But so I don't think it's an unsellable agenda at all, because we just lived through COVID, for goodness sake. I mean, that's an international issue that's come crashing through into everyone's living room. So I think that politically, the sale that I'm trying to advocate is one that broadens our coalition rather than undermines the mobilizing power of our own message, would be the way I would put it.
Thank you. Alan? And then Kadri.
Thank you very much, Jana. It's a great pleasure to hear David and you discussing these international issues and the role of Germany. So my name is Alain Desir. I'm the Senior Vice President Europe of the International Rescue Committee, and some in Germany could know me from my previous European functions in the French government or in the European Parliament. In this discussion, I would say from Wolfgang Ischinger and your two interventions, we see that for a long time, Europe was, or some in Europe, claiming that we should hope for a multipolar world. And now, in a way, we have it, and it's a big international disorder. So, okay, it's no more the Pax Americana, it's not the Cold War, but it's not more balanced at all. It's no more rules, no more accountability, no more respect for any kind of neither state rights or individual rights. So for Europe, the question, I think it was very well framed, is how to reconstruct a kind of rule-based order, but it's clear that we have to take much more into account the concern and interest of others, and that is very difficult if, I agree, we frame it as the West versus its enemy versus autocracies, because that's how it is now seen in many places. I mean, you mentioned China is a rivalry with US, and probably for US also that's the main issue. But now, perhaps also Russia wanted to show that it is still an issue, the European security architecture or their own interest. So there is again this confrontation of big powers, and in the way we react, if we only approach it as European democracies, of course, we are at risk. We have security concern, but also our conception of the international rule-based order to defend against those who are confronting us on this. We will win in General Assembly meetings, we will win the hearts everywhere else in the world. So if, in a way, to be consequent, we have to look at it from the start, from an international interest point of view, which means that issues like food insecurity now, even if, well, of course, we deal with Ukraine, but it has to be very high. Climate adaptation for those who suffer it in the global south, I would say. Access to vaccine was an issue that okay, at the end, we took good decision in Europe, but it was in a way too late to convince that we really prioritize this. The way we treat migration and refugees, and even now the discrimination, even if it's wonderful, the movement of solidarity to welcome Ukrainian refugees everywhere in Europe, and in Germany, it's absolutely exceptional, but it immediately raised in Africa the issue of the difference of treatment with people coming from Africa, or in the Middle East, people who are coming from Syria and also from Afghanistan in Asia. So I think that's the problem for Europe, is that we have to probably, as Europeans, promote the idea of a more autonomy strategy view. Europe has to defend by himself his views, but I don't think it's a good approach to think we will only rightly defend this by looking only at the European interest. Of course, there is European interest in terms of security, in terms of defending this democracy and this continent of peace. But in fact, we should, from start, much more consider that our role and our influence will depend on our capacity to be understood seriously, a serious actor globally, by the way we are the best allies of the other part of the world. Otherwise, they can consider, okay, we are one of these self-interest actors of this multipolar world, and what would they take side in a fight in Europe between the west of Europe and the east and Russia? That's the attitude of many people. It's your problem, mainly and more than our problem. So I was very much interested by the way you tried, and I will be interested to hear also from you, Jana, about how you see Germany here, not just because it is heading and sharing the G7 this year, but how could Germany as a European leader, together with France, Italy, many others, try to understand that we have to really take seriously our global role, not only because we need to reinforce our hard power, but by the soft power, which is in fact the real power, in a way, with bringing the rest of the world seriously with us in this new approach of what should be another kind of international relationships than the one we see established now. Thank you.
No, you first.
No, bring in your. Thank you, Alan.
Maybe I comment later, but we first hear from Kadri as well. And I have to look at the time because I'm told that you need to leave like right on time. So.
Lena's watching me. She's like,
okay,
don't
wonderful.
make long speeches.
Yeah.
Try to be short. I'm scared of the chair anyway. I'm Kadri, I'm Russia watcher here at CFR. And I've been thinking of the terms you have used, rule of law versus anarchy, accountability versus impunity. And you use them pretty much interchangeably. Coming from my Russia watcher perspective, it looks a bit different. When I think of Russia and Ukraine, Russia can be actually quite ruly place. It's not a rule of law, it's a rule of Kremlin. And within that frame, it's quite clear still who has impunity in the Russian system and who doesn't, and what the Kremlin's rule are. So it makes the country actually at times quite orderly place. And compared to that, Ukraine is pure anarchy, where people don't listen to authority, they challenge it. But in that anarchy, there are sort of seeds of freedom. But anarchy is partially what makes Ukraine a freer country than Russia. And they managed to have free elections, they managed to challenge their authority. So, from the perspective of that particular conflict, that set of terms probably doesn't communicate it ideally. Accountability versus impunity goes a lot closer. So I think that's a better fit. But in that context, I also had a question, because accountability can take many different shapes in different cultures. And I think, if the West wants to sort of reach out to the rest and have more of them with us in the same boat, we might want to become more tolerant about other forms of accountability in, countries like, I don't know, many African countries have their own sort of clan-based political systems that can be quite accountable, but just not Western type democracies at all. So I've been wondering, are we prepared to be sort of rule systems as no worse than ours, and to sort of give up on that instinct to impose our blueprint of democratic setup on everyone in the world? And secondly, which is more complicated, can we also sort of be more flexible in this respect when it comes to countries closer to Europe? I mean, countries like Ukraine or Moldova, for whom proximity to the European Union or harmonization of trade relations or something is the prize they are after in their relations with us. But still, there's domestic systems of accountability can be different, and implementing the whole European acquis can be different. So how to bridge that? I mean, there I see.
So I'll answer those, but if you're the Russia watcher, what is happening inside Russia at the moment? I mean, I'd be fascinated. Really?
That's a trick.
No, it's not a trick. I honestly, my answer is to your question much less interesting than what you say about what's going on. I mean, really.
So, Kadri,
What's going on inside the country? What's going on inside the Kremlin?
and what are the rules now?
No, honest answer is I do not know, and I don't think very many people do, even inside Russia. As I see it, the country is still in shock, trying to understand what happened. Both society and the elites in their own ways. They are trying to figure out how this will end and what will that mean for the country as a whole and for them personally. And it's dawned on everyone that decisions are made in a very small circle. I mean, I have quite good network of contacts in Moscow. None of them predicted that kind of war.
They all thought it wouldn't happen.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, they thought it was coercive diplomacy, and of the people who only 2 of my Moscow contacts said there is likely to be a war, but also they thought that it would be more limited or later. So basically, I think I guess Moscow establishment is undergoing a professional crisis because everything they thought they knew about Russia has turned out to be wrong. The president deceived not only the West, but also them.
But presumably they're also undergoing a personal crisis in the sense that their living standards have gone through the floor and their prospects are very murky.
And is there any sign for any kind of pushback? I mean, that's what we debated for a while in kind of Germany. Is there kind of this first signs of the system or the kind of trembling?
No, I don't think so, because the system is dependent on a few guys in power ministries. And for as long as they don't crumble, the system doesn't crumble. And, I can see a lot of resistance, people communicating in between lines, their criticism. Many of them have kept those skills from Soviet times when everyone knew very well how to do it. I can see all that revive, but I don't think that has any impact on the Kremlin. It can have impact on these people because really the rules are much more harsh now than even in the Soviet time. In the Soviet era, you wouldn't be arrested for standing in a blank piece of paper. Now, easy. So they don't even keep up the appearances for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't see it as sustainable, but I'm not prepared to predict when will the system crumble and how and what will trigger it.
Well, we know that personalist systems in the end die, not least because persons die, but the question is how long does it survive before it blows itself up?
And system is tired. It was tired already before war, but it's like tiredness of metal. You never know when it snaps.
Yeah, well, that's what they say about Ponzi schemes as well, that it doesn't take long for them to fall apart. I mean, very briefly, I'm
On the different rules.
I wouldn't go. I mean, I wouldn't associate myself with the first part of your description of the order as the rule of law in Russia. But I certainly am the first to say, I mean, surely no one can think that quote unquote democratic blueprints can be quote unquote imposed, which is what you said. I think one of the positive facets of an accountability versus impunity framing, and I think it's good that you pick me up on being too loose about it, but if you stick with accountability versus impunity, democratic governance is one form of accountability. Throw the so-and-sos out is the ultimate deterrent, the ultimate leverage on the disposition of power. But it's taken our own societies hundreds of years to grow democratic systems. So I feel that it's one of the advantages of the accountability versus impunity framing, that it recognizes that power can be held in check in a number of ways, albeit ones that are less decisive than a fully democratic system. And to state the obvious, within the democratic systems, there are differences, and there are parts that work better than other parts. So I think that's the strength of this, and I think the more inclusive coalition, in a way, the Singapore example speaks to that. It's not our job to say whether we like it or we don't like it. It's their system, and it does impose checks and balances. I don't know who your China watcher is here, but the China watchers say that they can see a significant difference within the Chinese system compared to when I was in office, 2007 to 2010. It's a different system today than it was 10, 15 years ago. And when the fellow at Stanford, I've forgotten his name, who writes about democratic recession, he says every type of regime has become less liberal. Democratic regimes have become less democratic, but illiberal regimes have become less liberal. And I think that's a significant point, and it argues against the black and white democracy versus autocracy framing. Now, I have to go and see one of your democratic institutions after this, and we've taxed people's patience for quite a long time. So
yeah, there was one question left, but
okay,
if you can take that one question still.
Sure. This is always a disaster because it's always the hardest question, and one I'm least able to answer.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you.
My name is Volker Jacobi. I'm the director of the newly founded European Center of Excellence for Civilian Crisis Management.
Oh, great.
The person I have for a long time wanted to see.
My question, or actually my comment is an attempt to link the question, what is going on inside the Kremlin, with the point you, Mr. Ischinger, raised earlier on, question about China. And I think we need to be careful not to make a mistake to think only about the Kremlin when thinking about Russia. So the regions of Russia, in particular those in closer vicinity to China, might have an interest in doing it their own way and moving away from the center in Moscow. For a number of reasons, the economic sustainability of Russia under heavy impact of sanctions is not guaranteed at all. And China is the partner of choice. And also when I look at where the conscripts come from who are dying in Ukraine, they do not come from Moscow. And this is becoming more and more publicly known. So when I look at that and link it to the question of what is China doing and how can we or could we convince China to play a more friendly role in the international rules-based system, I'm not so sure that we have to wait only a very short period of time. I think we have to wait for quite a long time because they are comfortably sitting back and waiting for the shambles to fall into their lap in what's going on in Russia. Would be interested in hearing your take on that, but
well, I think I'd say a couple of quick things. One, I think it's very interesting. Two, I think they think we're a bit of a shambles as well. So don't underestimate the degree of contempt is not quite the right word, but disdain about the way we conduct ourselves. I mean, maybe it speaks to something that you were that you were implying about the way in which we're understood. And then the third thing I would say, though, is that no one's got it easy at the moment. I mean, what's going on in China over the COVID disaster is a very, very significant on a whole number of dimensions, not least that personalist systems can get things very badly wrong. When they get them very badly wrong, they compound how wrong they go. But secondly, we don't know how it's going to play out. The economic consequences of lockdown in Shanghai alone are very significant for the Chinese economy. Never mind if this becomes a Beijing question. And the most interesting thing, of course, is that they can't really let go on the COVID front because of the consequent pressure on their hospital system. And why is that? Because of the fact that they haven't inexplicably, they haven't vaccinated the over 60s in sufficient numbers, even with their own vaccine, which isn't as successful as the mRNA. So this is quite, I think I don't want to become sucked into something too short term, but this COVID question could end up being a very long-term question for them.
Yeah, I think we start getting signals that you need to leave now. Thanks for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for
coming.